Hi YouTube, I'm Pete, and today we're going to be talking about Mercruiser trim. These are the early Mercruiser trims with the 2 holes and no external line. These have the 2 short hoses going to the transom of your boat. These are getting harder and harder to find. And when you do find them online, you see those lovely 3 little letters NLA, no longer available. So I've been stocking up. You can get them on eBay. You can get them new by companies called Sierra or GLM, and you can also get the rebuilding kits that way too. Also on eBay you can find a set of these cylinders, and they always say good working order, never in salt water. Great. You know, I've bought a bunch of these and they're fine. They last a season or 2 and then there's an issue. That's probably why Mercruiser changed them around a little bit. Anyway, we'll talk a little bit more about that, and we'll show you how to rebuild these things and the differences between the various cylinders that Mercruiser came out with within this same build with the 2 holes. Okay, let's get going. So as you can see here, I have several of the Mercruiser trim cylinders laid out. These are various trim cylinders that I've purchased over the years, and this past season I had the issue of a trim problem. My drive would go up and it stuck there. I had other issues as well, but right now we're just going to deal with rebuilding the trim cylinder and trying to figure out if that was indeed the total problem. You're going to have to need 2 trim cylinders, 2 working. If you have one that's bad, it's going to screw up the whole thing. So you really need to do this. They both have to work. So rather than buying new ones at approximately $300 a piece, $600 for a pair of trim cylinders, I'm going to rebuild these again. I've bought a couple over the years and I've lucked out. I've had a couple of good ones, and I've had a couple that have only lasted half a season or so. So it's really pot luck. But they are rebuildable, and the parts, most of them, are still available. So we're going to get into some details, and we're going to show you a couple of things about the cylinder. As I showed you before, the cylinder has 2 holes at one end. It's very important that when you disconnect these hoses that you use what's known as a flare nut wrench. They go all the way around the nut so that they don't strip the edges. Very, very important. The other thing that you want to make sure of is that these 2 holes are not stripped when you get them, when you take them off, when you put them back on. You want to be very, very careful with these, because if you screw up these threads, the compression fitting inside will not work. It's a flare, a special flared fitting, and it has to be seated properly. If the threads won't tighten, if it's cross-threaded, they will leak. You don't need Teflon tape on these. Teflon tape is going to make things worse for you. Don't put on the Teflon tape. They're basically just ready to go as they are with a flared special hose. And the hoses are about 6 to 8 inches long. You don't want those real long ones. You want the short ones, and 2 of them is what you're going to need for each side. 1 for up, 1 for down, same thing on the other side. The hoses have a 90-degree bend at one side, and the 90-degree bend goes in the cylinder. The straight end goes in the transom of your boat. And in case you forget when you take them off, on the back of the boat there's a distribution manifold, and there are 2 holes, one towards the bow of the boat and one towards the stern of the boat. And when you hook the cylinders up again, the front is to the bow and the rear is to the stern. Same with the hydraulic lines. So if you forget, it's real easy. Alright, so let's get into what we need to rebuild. You're going to need a plumber's wrench. it would help to have a vise that you can mount these things into. You're going to need a long screwdriver, a 1/2-inch box or open-end wrench. You're going to need a brush, preferably brass. Try not to use a stainless steel or a steel brush because the cylinders are fragile. You're going to need a hook tool or a very, very small screwdriver or punch to get underneath the old seals to get them off. A small flashlight would really be a great help because you're going to want to look down into that cylinder and see what's going on in there. And they're so long that the light really doesn't get all the way down to the bottom, and you really want to see what's going on in there because there's a lot that can go wrong. Even though there's not a lot of parts, there's a lot that can go wrong. Brake cleaner eliminates all grease, really cleans things up nice, and leaves you with a clean, evaporated, grease-free surface to work on. And you can lube everything up later with nice, fresh, new oil or grease, whichever you want to do. A Scotch-Brite pad really helps. A lot of times, these old cylinders, the internal components, have scuff marks on them, wear marks, and they can get a little bit pitted, and if you don't want to buy, or the component that you need is not available in LA, this will help to clear things up. You can just kind of nicely brush it up, make it look brand new again. Depending upon how involved you get and how much repair you're going to do, a pair of tweezers is going to be a necessity. So, let's get started. I'll show you what you need to be doing. So the first thing you're going to want to do is you're going to want to put this in the vise because you're going to need to unscrew this end cap. There it is in the vise. Plumber's wrench on the end cap. You always want to pull with the top jaw. Here we have the cylinder in the vise, and we've unscrewed this end cap to disassemble the cylinder. I'm going to take it out of the vise, and we're going to look at it on the bench. Here I have the cylinders on the bench. I recommend that you use a cookie sheet or something to catch the oil because it does get messy. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to pull the cylinder apart. And now we have the ram and we have the cylinder. Something I might add, you don't want to take these things and start cleaning them up with a wire wheel. Just because there's crud all over the outside, don't use the wire wheel. What winds up happening is these are very, very thin. You can't see it, but they really are. And right in here, where the cylinder meets the end cap, it's sealed. And it's a high pressure seal. And what winds up happening, you start cleaning stuff up. I've had this happen. You wind up getting a pinhole in here, and when this comes under pressure, it leaks. And I've used everything to try and seal it up again. JB Weld, made an entire bead around the outside, let it firm up and harden. The pressure is just too great. It just comes squirting out, and you're pretty much done. So if they look dirty, it's crap on the outside, that's why there's paint. Don't worry about it. It's under the water. No one's going to see it. So when you pull the cylinder apart, this is what you have. You have one end, the screw cap. You have what's known as the bushing. This is the most important thing. When you pull the cylinder apart, this little piece here has to come out. If you have a cylinder and you have this part and this is still stuck down in the bottom of this, it's next to impossible to get out. If it doesn't come out when you pull this out, you're in trouble. So let me show you what that thing does. This part is basically a hydraulic router. Now what I mean by that is, if you look at this end of the cylinder and you see these two holes, this goes up inside and it directs the flow of fluid to either the front or the back of this device. That's all this does. However, there are seals on the inside and the outside that go inside the cylinder, and if either one of these seals is bad, or this has corroded to the point where fluid will not flow either down through the center or in through the sides, it will impede the working of the cylinder, and there's your problem, or at least one of them. So this part has to come out of the bottom of this cylinder. This is the way it goes back together. But when you pull this out, you have to have this part. I've tried using a really long wire down the end of the cylinder. You go through here to grab it and try and pull it up and back out, and I have not yet gotten that to work. There's no way to get down in there. It's so darn long that you can't get all the way down into here. It's horrible. It's just absolutely horrible. And if this doesn't come out, you can't replace these seals, and when you put it back together, you'll never know if it's going to work or not. Again, here we have the cylinder. Hopefully this came out. We're going to be replacing these two seals on here. Nothing big, nothing crazy, just two seals. Then you remove this outer tube, and this is where most of your pressure gets absorbed. That thin little tube on the outside, it's aluminum and it's not very strong, and it's never going to hold pressure, and it corrodes and you get pinholes and all kinds of problems. This is where your pressure is being generated inside this inner liner tube, and this comes in both types of rebuilding kits, and we'll get into that in a moment. Here's the ram, here's the piston, here's the guide bushing, and the guide bushing seal. This is what you're going to be looking at. This one's nice and clean. I'm not going to have to worry about it too much, but because of issues I've been having, I am going to replace both the piston and the bushing. Now, this is where it gets crazy. First off, I would like to mention that there are two different cylinder rams for the same build, and I'll show you what the difference is. Here's one that's been disassembled, and I'm going to take a wild guess that this is the earlier of the two builds, and I'll tell you why. Generally, manufacturers like to cut costs, and I'm sure that when they machine this one piece, this is a nut that holds on that piston, that whole piston assembly, and it's a nut onto a machined shouldered shaft. It had to cost them a lot of money to make this. So here we have two different rams. Pistons are the same, but if you notice, this one has a bolt and this one has a nut, which means that all they had to do when they built this one, and that's why I'm thinking it's the later one, was to drill a hole in the end of this, tap it for the bolt. Works exactly the same, but I'm sure it cost them a lot less money to make this version than this one. So in order to go any further, we need to get this guide bushing off. This is something that we're going to be changing the seals on. There's a seal in the end, there's a seal on the outside, and there are two seals inside that ride along this shaft. In order to get this off, you'll notice it hits the piston. The piston has to come off. Whatever version you have, early or late, bolt or nut, this thing has to come off. So unfortunately, there are an incredible amount of tiny little components, springs, balls, guides within this thing to make this a check valve that works the way it's supposed to work. So it lets in pressure one way, lets it out the other. It's kind of crazy, but it's got to come off. So here is where we have an issue on which rebuilding kit to get. Whenever possible, I like to buy Quicksilver, original, Mercury, Marine parts. This is known as the seal kit. It's different from this one, which has the seal kit, but also contains that piston in one piece that I've been talking about. The seals that come in this kit can rebuild that piston, but it's a nightmare. It really is. I'll show you in detail what goes on with that, but if you had your choice as to which one you're going to rebuild with, I would go with the one that contains the piston. When you take off this nut or pull out a bolt, either way, take the whole piston, be very careful. If you want to put it in a vise, that would be great. Make sure it's vertical when you do it. And you undo the bolt and you pull it up very carefully. And what you wind up with is this piston assembly complete. So when you pull that sucker apart, it's got two halves, and the two halves are mated together, and there's only one way they can go together. There's two halves, and there's an emboss on one side. I don't know if you can see that, but there's only one direction that these can go together. Between the two is a seal. There are springs, balls, and bushings, and this is what comprises the check valve. One side is going to have 4 balls and 4 springs, and the other side is going to have 1 ball and 1 spring. What goes where? When you look at the outside, you're looking at something that looks like an old revolver, and the bullets go in the holes. Well, it's kind of the same kind of issue here. So which hole do you put which bullet in? That's the question. Okay. The key lies on the other side. Okay. You've got 4 and 1. And it's the same thing when you go to reassemble it. You've got 1, 2, 3, 4. You've got a drill mark that doesn't go anywhere. And you've got a hole that, if you look at the other side, there is a pinhole right there. Okay. So if you look at the springs, there are 4 meaty springs, and each one of those meaty springs has one of these little tiny bronze bushings on it. Now, the bronze bushing side that has the edge all the way around goes against the ball. So the ball gets dropped in the cylinder. The bushing end of the spring goes down against the ball, and then when you have all 4 in place, this washer with the seal goes on top and holds them all down. This is where I believe that the bolt design is superior, because when you drop the bolt in, it holds all of this stuff sort of in place by the weight of the bolt sliding through. But if you have the one that you have to put the whole thing together, you have to put the entire assembly over the end of this shaft and then assemble it with the nut. So the 4 meaty springs go on one side, and on the other side goes this really fine little spring and that goes in that small remaining hole on the other side, with, of course, 2 of these sleeves, one going down with the edge coming up, and one of them on the top of the spring. So when you drop the bolt through or slide it on the cylinder, there's one of these tiny little bushings pointing up, and that's going to hold the ball and the spring inside this check valve piston assembly. Here's the bushing. I've cleaned it up, and inside this bushing, I don't know if you can see it, there's 2 grooves on the inside, and there are 2 seals that form, there are 2 seals in there that have to be replaced, and they go over this shaft. There's also 1 flat seal that goes over here, 1 flat seal that goes on this end, and an O-ring that goes in the middle. So once you assemble that entire piece, here we have the old one for reference. Rubber O-ring, there's 2 seals inside, 2 O-rings, and when you put it back together, the tube will slide down over the piston and mate right there, just like that. And that whole assembly is going to go back inside the cylinder. There's the piston, there's a seal on there, there's that little, if you look at the end, you can see 1, 2, 3, 4 springs with the balls inside there. There's one of these guides and one of these springs. The guide goes down on top of the ball so that the spring sits on top with the guide. Here's the spring. Here's the spring with the bushing guide already installed, and that will go on top of one of the check balls in the holes. There's the piston, there's a seal on there, there's that little, if you look at the end, you can see 1, 2, 3, 4 springs with the balls inside there. There's one of these guides with the bushing guide already installed, and that will go with one of the balls into one of the check ball holes in the cylinder, like so. The bolt goes through the outside, or if you're putting it on the old style, that slides all on the shaft, and that's pretty much the whole thing. Sounds simple. It's very frustrating, but when you're done, hopefully you'll have a set of trim cylinders that work. Again, the main components: the guide bushing, the directing valve, piston rod and shaft with the piston rod with shaft with the piston, the guide bushing, and before you put anything together, remember to put this end cap on, guys, because it has to screw onto the cylinder. Mercruiser recommends sealing this with one of their sealers. Personally, I like Permatex makes it. It's a Teflon thread sealer. And the reason I like to use this is the reason that we couldn't get the end cap off originally. That stuff just hardens up over the years and you can't get anything apart. So there you have it. highlights of rebuilding the Mercruiser trim cylinders, the early version with the 2 holes at one end of the cylinder. And I'm going to get to work now and put these things back together, and hopefully that will take care of all my problems, at least with the boat.